Chapter 9. As Dave watched the road, traffic started to pass by him, almost all of it from the east, moving away from the population center of Boston and its surrounding suburbs. He took time to drink water and scarf down a can of beef stew. He took the binos and wrapped them in his sniper's face veil, a camouflage net that would hide his lenses but not obscure his vision appreciably. Under his little hooch, he changed out of his green Dockers and into his olive green jungle pants. Like his shirt, it was sprayed in light stripes with black spray paint. He tied them off at his ankles and made sure his hiking boots were tied with the laces tucked away. Rooting around in one of the ammo pouches on his belt, he removed an old section of Humvee mirror he had carried in the service. It had been cut down and backed with green duct tape, 100-mile-an-hour tape in Army parlance. Using tubes of green and brown camo cream, he painted his face and neck, using the lighter green on the dark areas of his face and the dark brown on the high points. Making sure he covered his ears well, he tried to slip into his tactical mindset. This was the most dangerous area he had to cross, and he was sure that after this he would be home free. Taking his wind-up radio from his pack, he again scanned the AM bands. What he heard only intensified his tactical animal. Message repeats. Forces from International Security Assistance Forces, ISAF, the announcer droned, pronouncing ISAF, are here to protect their individual nation's interest in the United States. They are also volunteering to assist the Department of Homeland Security in protecting the American people from terrorists, both foreign and domestic. Do not interfere with them as they go about their duties. Their presence here is in compliance with United Nations Declaration 6664 and covered under the International Agreement on Infrastructure Protection. President Billary has opened America's doors to our friends from Europe who have stated that they wish to repay America for all that America has done for the world. Compliance with the ISAF forces is mandated by special legislation passed last night in an emergency joint session of Congress, and further backed by a UN resolution passed this morning in New York City. These cities in our broadcast area are currently under curfew. Boston and surrounding suburbs, Providence and Rhode Island, Hartford and East, and the New York City metropolitan area to include Western Connecticut. Anyone attempting to defect to areas that are refusing to comply with the legal government of the United States are subject to arrest and detainment. Any residents of the following states and areas who are now in the safe areas, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and northern New York State, and any other state not mentioned, are to report to the closest U.S. Post Office facility to register with the Department of Homeland Security. As you know by now, President Billary has declared specific areas to be in open violation of many of the security measures passed in light of the terrorism committed against the American people in the last 2 years. ISAF troops will be moving into these areas to protect the assets committed to their respective governments under the Debt Consolidation and Repatriation Act of this year. Persons are directed by Executive Order 5712 to stay in their homes or places of work unless transiting from one to the other. Anyone on the road in violation of this order will be subject to detainment for an unspecified length of time. Anyone found in possession of prohibited items, including firearms, narcotics, food for more than a 2-day period, gasoline over 15 gallons, any gasoline in a separate container, and two-way radios capable of broadcasting on frequencies above 23 centimeters will be subject to forfeiture of property used to facilitate said crimes and criminal and civil penalties not to exceed $1 million in fines and or 25 years in federal detention. We repeat, if you are traveling, return to your homes. If you are in possession of prohibited items, turn them into your local Homeland Security forces. If you have knowledge of persons violating these terms, please contact your local Homeland Defense forces. Rewards of up to $500 are now being offered for successful reports of antisocial hoarding and activity. In local news, a Moosup couple is dead after their son-in-law, currently wanted on charges of antisocial behavior through non-compliance with the Terrorist Control Act, engaged police in a 3-hour standoff this week. Police have identified David McGrath, 43, of Lower Quinnipiac, as the shooter. The standoff ended with the house of Mr. and Mrs. Ted Peterson being burned to the ground after the couple were killed execution style by McGrath. Police reports indicate that McGrath, a decorated Army veteran and known anti-government activist, used an accelerant to set the two-story fire, likely gasoline. 3 police officers were killed and 7 wounded in the shootout. McGrath's remains were not found in the charred rubble of the house, and he is presumed to be armed and very dangerous. A manhunt is underway for him. The Electrical Resource Allocation Board today announced new restrictions. Dave listened as the voice droned on. Well, he thought, I wonder where the bloodhounds are. He thought about the implication of the news report and decided it didn't change his situation much. He was committing about 40 felonies as it was. 2 or 3 more wouldn't matter, especially since he hadn't committed any acts of murder and the laws he were breaking were unconstitutional anyway. The activity on the road increased. Dave watched in grim fashion the parade of cars and trucks heading west. Where do they think they are going, he asked himself. No place to go, nothing to do when they get there. Dave looked at the road below. It was the second time in his life he had seen refugees. The African sun beat down on the men dressed in their brown body armor and Kevlar helmets. The scout platoon and their attached snipers were in overwatch position, covering a roadblock manned by men from their battalion's B Company. For this deployment, they were using armored Humvees, either mounting M2 heavy-barrel Browning 50 caliber machine guns or Mark 19 40mm grenade launchers. Dave had his squad dismount their Mark 19 and mount it on its M3 tripod to cover the main road. The second Humvee's M2 was deployed on top of the Humvee to provide flanking fire on the secondary road that came in from their left. If needed, the Humvee could move rapidly to one of 3 pre-selected spots to provide covering fire for the Gunch 300 meters below them. The GIs manning the roadblock were in a tight spot. Their rules of engagement prevented them from firing on anyone unless they themselves were fired upon. Manning a roadblock, their job was to prevent people from reaching the capital, which lay 20 some odd miles behind them. The mass of refugees was spurred into a panic by reports that the rebel forces were moving towards them on a murderous, drug-fueled spree of raping and destruction. They were rumored to practice a bizarre form of human sacrifice, the specifics of which are left to the listener's imagination, and were known for their brutality to those not of their tribe. As far as the Americans were concerned, they should be allowed to shoot every one of them they saw carrying a gun. Ironically, that is just what they were not allowed to do. Several times they saw armed gangs of men assaulting members of the approaching throng and dragged them screaming into the tree line. "Let me smoke 'em, Sergeant," asked Specialist Ruiz, watching through his crosshairs as yet another nubile young woman was dragged into the trees, her children left alone and crying by the side of the road. The emotion in his voice was bordering on tears. "No can do, Ruiz," answered Dave. "I don't like it either, but we have orders." "Well, the orders suck," spat the tall Cuban. Ruiz's parents had risked their lives to take their 3 small children on a perilous trip in a leaky boat, landing in the dead of night near Miami. They had taught him about the evils of oppression from an early age. Dave agreed, although he held his tongue. Surely the American government would see what was happening and let them act with honor, act as soldiers. The soldiers manning the checkpoint had a harder time. Trying unsuccessfully to stem the flow of wretched, half-starved women and children, they saw the fear and desperation in their eyes. Although ordered to not allow anyone passage towards the beleaguered capital, in practice they only presented token resistance to the refugees, who only had to step around the roadblock to pass by. The Americans had been ordered to block the road, and they did. Their orders did not tell them to block the shoulders of the road. The troops manning the roadblock did what they could for the injured refugees. Sometimes it was nothing more than retightening loose bandages or handing out aspirin. The faces devoid of hope will be something they would all remember forever. The refugee tide continued as the sun got higher in the sky. Typically, all activity slowed or stopped from close to noon until 2 due to the heat. As the crowd continued to pulse forward like a living beast with 1,000 legs, sounds of gunfire reached the ears of the entrenched Americans. Gradually, the sounds of motors could be heard between the burst of gunfire. The throng scattered as a murmur came up the line. People surged past the Americans, seeking the safety of having the paratroopers between themselves and the gunfire. Finally, Ruiz and Gunter, his spotter, reported to Dave, "Sergeant McGrath, I've got 3 or more trucks coming up the road. Big Mercedes troop carriers with Russian 51s on top. They look like they're headed this way." "Roger that, Ruiz. Keep an eye on them and remember our ROE, even if it does suck." "Huh, Sergeant," answered Ruiz, settling the Remington M24 into his shoulder. McGrath was in the habit of carrying his own radio and unclipped the handset to call or report to battalion. "Sierra 5-3, Sierra 5-3, this is Lima 2-9er, come in, over." Static hissed from the handset. "Lima 2-9er, this is Sierra 5-3, go ahead, over." 5-3, we've got at least 3 troop trucks. Ruiz waved a hand. "Break. I've got 4 trucks with troops and 3 technicals. 5-3, that's 4 troop trucks with heavy weapons and 3 technicals approaching our location. They are attacking the civilians. Break. We request permission again to engage them. Over." A pause, as if the puzzled palace were discussing the merits of that. "Negative, 2-9er, negative. The ROE stands. You are only to fire to protect the lives of U.S. forces and U.S. citizens. Do you copy? Over." Dave sounded as dejected as he felt. "Roger, 5-3, I understand. Lima 2-9er out." "Listen up," said Dave into his privately purchased Marine VHF radio. "If these turd burglars so much as point a weapon at you, light 'em up. Got it?" "Roger. Huh." "It's about time," came the replies from the other Humvee and the troops at the roadblock. Dave had given the NCO in charge of the roadblock the extra handheld radio that operated above the frequency of their heavy GI issuance. In Africa, they weren't worried about what the FCC would say. The trucks pulled up to the roadblock in a cloud of dry red dust. From the lead truck, a gaudily clad man leapt down, his movements quick and jerky. A voice came over the VHF. "Looks like he's hopped up." They watched through binos and rifle scopes as the man approached the roadblock and began screaming at the American soldiers. "Recon," said the voice of the B Company NCO, "keep your eyes on these dudes. They're demanding that we give them our weapons and vehicles and clear the roadblock, as they represent the sovereign government of this rat-infested sewer." "Roger, we got your back, Sergeant Gooch." The wildly gesticulating sovereign government representative turned to the vehicles, waving at the men to come down. Dave saw the B Company platoon leader in charge leave the cover of his Humvee and approach the leader. As he called out, the convoy leader whirled, pointed his AK at the lieutenant ever so briefly. "Take him," said Dave. Ruiz fired, and the man started doing another dance, as most of his head disappeared in a pink cloud. The lieutenant stood there open-mouthed as the nearly headless corpse ran around the road, blood spurting from the remains of his throat. Before the echo of Ruiz's shot had died, another shot rang out. The driver of the lead truck had just shot the stunned lieutenant. The lieutenant dropped heavily onto the macadam. Almost immediately, a cacophony of gunfire rang out. The 50s on the Humvees, 2 at the roadblock and the 1 to Dave's left, opened up. The 2 Mark 19s were in action, pumping 40mm high-velocity grenades into the troop compartments and engine areas of the trucks. The troops at the roadblock were keeping up a steady fire. The M4s, M203s, SAWs, and the platoon's 2 M240s were raking the technicals and trucks. Dave saw that the 2 Mark 19s were alternating fire to keep a constant rain of 40mm high explosive on target. Dave immediately keyed his radio. "Sierra 5-3, this is Lima 2-9er. We are in contact. Repeat, we are in contact. We need immediate fire support at pre-registration point Budweiser." "Say again, Budweiser. We have 7 vehicles full of armed hostiles engaging U.S. troops. We have 1 line 2, over." "Copy, 2-9er. 1 line 2, negative on fire support. The ambassador sent them packing. Said they were too offensive. Break. We are moving up the reaction force. They should be there in 20 mics, over." Roger, 5-3. We'll give you a sit rep in 5. 2-9 are out. Releasing his headset, he dropped from kneeling to prone and flipped the covers off his ACOG scope. Looking over to Rant, one of the two M203 gunners on the hill. Rant, take James and Hanson and cover the left flank. I don't want to get surrounded. Who that, Sergeant? Rant replied, getting up and tearing off down the line. Reacquiring his reticle, Dave saw that most of the rebels were dead. Apparently one technical had gotten away. He drew a bead on a man firing an RPD in a long burst over the heads of the B Company men at the roadblock and slowly squeezed the trigger. Dave felt the relatively soft recoil of the M4, and when he reacquired his sights, the man was laying on his back, the RPD silent. Dave heard the steady fire from Ruiz's bolt gun as he engaged several more rebel troops. Finally, he saw no more movement. Cease fire, he called, hearing the command get picked up and down the line. Only shoot the live ones. Heavies, take turns reloading. Dave got on the VHF as the firing faded at the roadblock. Gooch, how's the LT? Silence. Then a voice. He's okay, got hit in the plate, no penetration. He figured playing possum was safer than John Wayning it between his pissed off men and our new 50 caliber qualification range. Dave laughed. I'm going to have my sniper and shooters make sure those toads are dead. Reaction force should be here in 15. Yeah, we're on with the battalion right now on our push. Thanks for the cover, that was some shot. I thought the LT was a goner for sure. Thanks. I'll let Ruiz know. Ruiz looked over at him with a question on his face. Sergeant Gooch says good shot, Ruiz. Ruiz shot back a grin. Now, show me headshots on any of them that look like they have the strength to pull a trigger. Ruiz nodded. My pleasure, he said, and set about his task with a grim smile on his face. Dave called out, all my ACOGers, make sure those POSs are dead. The rest of you, I want casualty ammo check now. Dave walked the perimeter as the infrequent shot rang out from Ruiz's position. Checking on his men, he found no wounded, no shortage of ammo. Having Humvees to hump ammo sure helps, mused Dave, and good spirits all around. About time we did something proactive, said Barnes. Hey, Sergeant, we hit any collaterals? Asked Weissman, his junior RTO. None that I could see. Those people boogied before that last truck stopped moving. Charlie Company showed up in the backs of several Humvees and medium trucks and secured the area. After policing up the battlefield, they had 67 confirmed dead tangos, 2 American flesh wounds, and about 1,000 cheering refugees. After this incident, the troops from Dave's brigade were relegated to a role on the coast of the country where they were less likely to encounter armed hostiles. The ambassador wanted them gone, saying that people had a way of dying around paratroopers. Dave's men nodded their assent. Bad people die around us, said Weissman. Coming as it did from a pimply 18-year-old just out of basic, his sentiment was well received by the company. Dave crawled back into his hooch and leaned back to think for a few minutes while listening to the AM band for any intel. As he looked at the space blanket hanging above him, he paused. If he was going to be here all day, he didn't want to create more of a thermal signature than he had to. Reaching into his pack, he pulled out his lightweight poncho and a few bungees, and strung it up a few inches under the space blanket to provide a heat barrier between his body and the silver blanket. Feeling better, he turned on his Yaesu. Noon was approaching. Being further north and on higher ground, plus being in such tight quarters, he decided against stringing up his 292 antenna. Instead, he connected it to the little radio and strung it around his hide. Hopefully, it would do its job. Sure enough, at noon, he heard the carrier wave on today's frequency. Motley Crue's song, Home Sweet Home, came over the earpiece. Dave smiled. His friends certainly had their sense of humor intact. As the song ended, Sandy's voice came on the air. Hurry home, she said. The signal went off. Dave smiled. I am hurrying, he thought. But speed could kill. Better to get home safe than to go home to the campfire in the sky. He still had things to do. A steady throbbing sound broke him from his reverie. Helicopters. Big ones. Maybe Chinooks. He crawled to the lip of his hide and scanned the roadway and sky. To the right, towards Boston, the road went up another rise and turned from sight. At the lower edge of the rise he saw 8 figures, 4 from each side of the road, run out. All were dressed in woodland BDUs and carried rifles. Some dragged freshly cut trees, others donned fluorescent vests. Signaling for the cars on the road to stop and reinforcing that signal with rifles at the shoulder, they dragged the trees across the road to make a crude roadblock. As they did, Dave saw 2 men, one carrying an Alice pack with a long whip antenna poking up from it. The man with him took the proffered handset and spoke into it. The sound of the helos grew louder, the ground beginning to vibrate so that Dave could feel it, his whole body thrumming. Coming in over the highway, from the little valley to the northeast, came 2 huge birds, which banked and turned towards Dave. He recognized them as sea stallions, or a variant, CH-53s. These bore a green and dark brown camouflage pattern Dave recalled as being German. Viewing them with his binos, Dave saw the distinctive Maltese cross on the nose of the closest one, with a white rectangle below which wore the black letters ISAF. The helos quickly sat down on the highway on each side, the one on Dave's side closer by 100 meters or so. He saw the crew chief scramble from the rear of the 2 big birds as 2 Apache attack helicopters swept over them a few hundred feet from the treetops. As Dave watched, he could see the activity at the rear of the CH-53s. Suddenly, from the rear of one, then the other, camouflage jeeps of a kind Dave only recognized as being European sped from the rear of each bird. One sped towards the blocking crew, the other headed past Dave to stop just past the overpass to the left of the hide. Turning his focus back to the stallions, Dave's mouth dropped open as a small armored vehicle rolled off the back ramp. Hardly taller than the crew chief, it sported a tiny turret with what looked like a 20mm cannon sticking out from it. "Weasels," said Dave. He certainly never expected to see German Fallschirmjäger armor in New England in the fall. Like the scout cars, one weasel headed for the overpass and one for the crude roadblock. Then troops began pouring from the stallions, about 30 in all. They carried rolls of wire, steel pickets, and other items. They fell in and started towards the overpass. As they cleared the helicopters, the big bird's engines changed in pitch, and they took off one at a time, heading west. Dave watched the troops set up a better roadblock with triple-strand concertina wire, engineer pickets, and a growing sandbag emplacement near the bridge abutments. What the heck was going on, he wondered.